Tell me about agency within mathematics.
Sure. So basically, all I'm doing is noticing that mathematics has an economic structure. By agency, I'm referring specifically to economic agency, which is essentially an abstract mathematical structure itself. We often think about it referring to human beings who have like faces that we recognize and choices that we see as choices in a sort of human, conscious, cognitive, mental sense. But the underlying mathematical structure of agency doesn't reference any of those experiences. And if you look at math, you see it has a lot of the same properties that we associate with economics. You have trade offs, like trade offs between odd numbers and even numbers. You have scarcity, which is the inability to get everything that you want. If you have, say the real numbers, you have a complete ordering, but you can't define the square root of -1. If you try to define the square root of -1, you're going to lose your complete ordering. So you're making trade offs. There are other things that look like choice, and choice is maybe a little bit more of an abstract concept because you're not moving through time. But mathematicians actually talk about choice all the time. Like a very important concept in math is something called a natural transformation. A natural transformation means that you have two options and it doesn't matter which one you choose. So, natural transformation is like a super fundamental, very important idea, and it's about choice. And you're always talking about choice in math. So, like, a very simple way to prove, like, say, how many isomorphisms you have from one set to itself. Like, if you're dealing with a finite set, you would say, well, the first element you're mapping has this many choices. And then the next element you're mapping has that many choices minus one, and so on. And so you're just constantly naturally talking about choice and other economic things. So to me, to look at that and say, okay, mathematics behaves kind of like an economic agent is entirely a reasonable claim. And I don't mean it to be a big, like, I know it sounds big, like, well, math has agency, math can choose. I actually mean something pretty small. I'm just saying, here's a common structure between mathematics and economics. So I'm going to point that out and try to analyze it.
Right. Yeah, it's interesting that when you look at agency within mathematics, you kind of go, okay, there are things like scarcity, there are things like choice, and so you know, and in wanting to do that, it's interesting because like in part of the motivation when you give a talk called agency at the very bottom, it's kind of like you know people like Michael Evan are doing experiments where we see say cells have a kind of intelligence or competencies, and it's like if there's something even fundamental to something like mathematics where there is these kinds of economic properties, right? There's some kind of scarcity there, then maybe it's not that surprising that basic kind of life does have kinds of intelligence. But tell me a bit more about, so for example, choice in mathematics. I mean, so you said it's actually basic in mathematics, but tell me a bit more about why it's reasonable to think about mathematics in these kinds of agentic terms.
When I'm thinking about choice in mathematics, what I'm thinking about is structure preservation. So the actual line of reasoning there is fairly abstract and would probably take us a while to really elaborate why I think that makes sense. But the basic idea is when you're making a choice, you can think of that as preserving your internal structure onto the world. So are you familiar with concepts about internal models?
Kind of, but maybe elaborate on that.
Sure. So, one theory that's sort of gaining in popularity in psychology and neuroscience is this idea that human beings and organisms in general behave by having an internal model, some kind of system of relationships inside themselves built out of neurons or whatever else they have that basically models their environment. And they use that internal model to guide their decision making. So, their model predicts, like, don't go here, there could be a predator. So, they avoid that and they go somewhere else. And in economics, there's something highly congruent there, which is we think of people as having preference order, which is again an internal system of relationships. Now, economists are usually uh, like ambivalent as to what that actually means. Agnostic is the word, agnostic as to what that means in terms of neuroscience and whatever, and that's fine because they're economists. But you could think of people as having an internal model that represents their preferences, and they act according to that internal model. And the goal is to preserve the structure of that internal model onto the environment. And if your internal model is your preferences, then when you successfully make your environment look like your internal model, which is what active inference is all about, then you are successfully making your environment look like your preferences. So you're making your environment look the way you want. And sort of the fundamental idea there is just a structure preserving map, some kind of function from your internal structure to the structure around you. And if you have that, you have economic choice. And math, famously, is all about structure preserving functions. I mean, you are constantly exploring structure preserving functions in math. So when I'm thinking about choice, I'm thinking about structure preservation.
So yeah, let me see if I understand this. This is interesting. So in cognitive science at the moment, kind of predictive processing, active inference, we're making models, and let's understand that in a cognitive sense. But actually, you could argue like in an analogous way, economics is doing that because um, preferences is the kind of thing of like what you want and internally, and it's like if I make the world like that, then I will be satisfied, and I can order that. So, if I get something a little worse than my optimal outcome, then I'll be a little less happy. I'll have a little less utility, but you're still there's a kind of ordering of what I like and what I dislike. Um, and I guess so to link that then to mathematics and to go like there, it's kind of like, I mean, a lot of economics, especially, is actually just kind of trying to mathematize what people's choices essentially, and like sometimes it's kind of basic mathematics just applied to humans, and it can make them look a bit caricaturish and people criticize that, but like it's an interesting representation of what they are. And so I guess in that sense it's making me think it's a little more natural to apply these kinds of concepts to mathematics. It's almost like doing the other way around essentially. Like if economists think, hey, why don't we apply mathematics to economics and human decision making, it's like, but if we look at mathematics from that perspective, like what does that say about mathematics? It's actually kind of pretty interesting. Okay,
Yeah, so instead of mathematical economics, it's economical mathematics.
right. And why did you want to look at? Why did you want to do that and look at how mathematics had agency?
It was totally just an accident. I was in college as an undergrad, just trying to figure out what are we talking about ever? Because like there's all these basic concepts in economics that are never pinned down. So scarcity, trade offs, self interest, preferences, choice, rationality. Uh, Economists talk about these things, and some of them have kind of formal definitions like rationality does, but a lot of them, if you talk to people like, what is this, what are we talking about, they won't ever give you a very clear answer. It's all very hand wavy. Like, what is self-interest? Well, it's like a euphemism for selfishness. Okay, so do we think people are selfish? No, we don't really think that. But like, okay, what are we assuming? Just like, what are we talking about? Like, what is scarcity? Like, economists will tell you it's about having finite resources. But that's false. If we look at math, we can see that finite is not relevant to the concept of scarcity. So I was literally just, as an economics student, just trying to figure out what are we talking about when we talk about these things. And when I was trying to just explore those ideas, I noticed that mathematics has a lot of what we normally associate with just the physical world. And then this talk with Mike was just an accident. I'd sent him an email about some ideas. He was like, "Great, why don't you talk to my lab about that?" I was like, "Wait a second, Mike, I'm not a mathematician. I'm just spitballing here." He's like, "Great, I'll give you 2 months to like figure it out and solve everything." I'm like, okay. So we did it. I thought it went okay, but it was not something I never intended. I'm not a mathematician for the listeners. I'm not. And so I never intended to like represent myself that way, but it happened and people were very interested. I got a lot of interesting emails about it. So I'm glad it happened. And I'm glad Mike doesn't care that, well, Mike is very open minded. He talks to a lot of interesting people. And I think that's a valuable strategy for him.
And let's then try and go through this kind of and try and maybe get to the conclusions of like what do we think mathematics is, what kind of things can it do. You said there that finite is not relevant to the concept of scarcity, right? So trying to if we try and better understand something like scarcity, then you kind of in that talk argue, I mean, scarcity is maybe something fundamental to agency. Like you have to have scarcity in order to be able to make choices, and you need constraints. So maybe that's somewhere to start, like redefining what we mean by even scarcity, so that we can try and think about agency and choice within mathematics.
Yes, absolutely. So a lot of people try to define, what is agency? And Mike has talked about how he's not really a fan of trying to define things. And I'm not a fan of trying to define things either. I think scientists often go wrong when they try to set out, like, here is the definition of this. Like, real life, I think, does not work that way. There's a very important paper by Lisa Feldman Barrett, who I talk about constantly. She's very influential to me. The paper is called Are Emotions Natural Kinds? So, natural kind is like a concept that exists in reality, not just in our heads, but like it's truly part of the world. So, like something that's not a natural kind is America. America doesn't like really exist. We just think it does because it's useful. A natural kind is a concept that's not like America. In that paper, Are Emotions Natural Kind, Lisa argues that emotions have been historically thought of as natural kinds, but they actually aren't. And I think that argument generalizes very naturally. Pretty much everything that we believe in is not a natural kind. And I believe that agency is also not a natural kind. So I'm not looking for like a hard, definite definition of what agency is. When we call something agentic, we are making a practical categorization decision for the predictions that it lets us make. If I believe you are agentic, that makes different predictions from if I believe you are some inert object. So I'm just trying to make a useful model. So what I'm trying to do is analyze, when is it useful for us to model things as agentic? And I think the obvious answer to that is we model things as agentic when we see things making choices. So then the question is, when do we see things making choices? The answer is whenever there are trade-offs in their environment that they have to navigate. Okay, where do trade-offs come from? And I argue that that is because of scarcity. Scarcity is the condition where trade-offs come from. If you don't have scarcity, you won't have trade-offs. So where does scarcity come from? And the answer economists have usually given is that scarcity is about having finite physical resources. Because there is only so much food in the world, we have to make allocation decisions about where to allocate that food. But if we had an infinite amount of food, we wouldn't have to do that. That sounds good, but when you look at math, it breaks down. If you just look at the natural numbers versus the real numbers, you have an infinite amount of natural numbers, as we hopefully all know. But if you have a job, a goal for the natural numbers, and you say, my goal for you is I'm going to assign to each of you one natural number to each of the real numbers, then even though there are an infinite amount of natural numbers, you will run out of natural numbers. You do not have enough of them to assign one natural number to each real number because there are even more infinite real numbers than there are infinite natural numbers. So infinity does not stop you from running out of some resource.
Interesting. I mean, in that then way of looking at infinite resources, you have to have a kind of like person like you going looking at it and going like, I'm gonna make this mapping. But then again, it's kind of like, now that I say that, it's more like a mathematical proof. You're just saying like, if one wanted to do this, and you have an infinite resource, but actually that infinite resource is like a smaller infinity than this other infinite thing, and so there's some way in which that infinite thing is bounded still. So then you could say there's something like there's scarcity there. There's scarcity in this infinite thing. Is that kind of
Yes.
correct?
Mhm.
Okay, okay, and 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 from there, so I mean, and from there, it's like there's then limits to what different kinds of mathematics can do, or would you say something like some mathematics is better than other mathematics because it can do more? Let's say, like, if you had a greater infinity, it can do more than this smaller infinity.
Yes. So you can talk about the limits of math, and you can talk about some things being better for other things at a particular task. Infinity, I don't actually know so much about, so that's not what I'll focus on. But first of all, math does have
Okay.
limitations. I argue those limitations are fundamentally due to logical consistency. So, do you know the principle of explosion? Yeah, so the principle of explosion says that if you
Please explain
contradict
that.
yourself, you can prove anything. So if I assume P and not P, I can derive any Q. So under that view, you're totally unlimited. But if you say, hold on, we have to be logically consistent, then you start running into limitations. Like if you say, I want an odd number where if I divide it by 2, I get an integer, you're not going to be able to do that. So math has limitations. Those limitations are still very broad. You can still obviously do an incredible amount of things, but there are things in math that you cannot do. Or at least if you choose to do them, you will end up giving up something else. And relatedly, for a mathematical purpose, there are objects that are better than other objects. So an example is the Cartesian product. So for I have a paper on my website about this. It's an essay, not a paper, but it's called "The Definition of the Cartesian Product is Weird." So for a given Cartesian product, there are other sets that you could use to do the job of the Cartesian product, but they would just be worse at it. So what a Cartesian product is, a product of two sets, like graphing in the Cartesian plane, like on a piece of paper, like you had to do in school. You remember graphing and stuff. That's what the Cartesian product is. It's just graphing things on a two-dimensional coordinate plane. And if you have a set that like doesn't fill in all the points on that graph, that set is not a good Cartesian product. Or if you have a set that has too many points and will like fill in some points multiple times, that's also a bad Cartesian product. What you want is an efficient Cartesian product that fills in each point on the graph exactly one time. And that's the best Cartesian product. So even math can compare things and say, this object is better for this mathematical job than this other object. Which isn't how you usually learn
And from
math.
that,
Yeah, go ahead.
yeah, no, go on. Yeah, yeah, I see. No, I mean, like, yeah, you kind of learn how to do maths, or like, but then like exploring it more deeply, like you, and so like from these kinds of things, having some maths being better than others, how do you get to something like agency? Is it still a
So
long path to get there?
you're already there by the time you're talking about that. I'll
Yeah.
reiterate that I think that agency is a very small thing. When I'm talking about something being agentic, I think people hear a big claim. I think
Mm.
I'm making a small claim. To me, saying math is agentic isn't that much more dramatic than saying, like, gravity makes oranges fall from trees. Like, imagine some weird history of physics where, Isaac Newton, the apple fell on his head. And so people said, okay, gravity is a theory about apples. All I'm doing is coming along and saying, well, it also applies to oranges and lemons and stuff. Like it's all fruit, really, and maybe even vegetables and all
Mm.
kinds of things. And so I see myself as really making a small claim akin to saying that oranges are affected by gravity. Math being agentic is pretty simple. And basically, as soon as you have scarcity, as soon as you have trade offs, as soon as you have structure preservation, you have something that you can reasonably call agentic. And again, remember, it's just a practical modeling choice. I'm not saying that there's some true definition of agency that math meets. It's just useful to say that math is agentic because that lets us ask certain questions. Like, is this mathematical structure better than that mathematical structure for this purpose? Or do we have scarcity in this system? Things like that.
So that's fair enough. So maybe we shouldn't think of it as a giant claim to say something is agentic. But then again, yeah. And so then reconceptualizing agency as something actually that you can minimally get, like saying something as simple as mathematics. I mean, what do you think are the implications for? Because for say how we understand life and the universe. Because yeah, Michael Levin will talk about, well, he has stuff on like sorting algorithms, and like you have things which are like simple computer code, and people think they know what they're doing, but then if it comes up with surprising things to you, then it's like actually you need to do kind of experiments to see like what these algorithms were actually doing. And sometimes he kind of proposes, well, maybe there's something even basic to things like mathematics. He gives this example of, imagine you're making a triangle and you have two angles already. Well, if you know the two angles, then the third angle is kind of given to you already. Like, you don't need to put any effort into understanding the third one. You kind of like the structure of the universe and the fact that triangles are how they are, they just give you the third angle. And similarly, he talks about like ion channels in biology, and you just kind of get logic gates out of them, like just by virtue of them being there, you can kind of start to it just simple logic exists in the universe. And if you have a biological system that kind of emulates the things that we can do on computers, then like that gives it certain competencies. So what do you think? Yeah.
Yes. So I'll say, first of all, as far as I'm aware, Mike has expressed that he believes in some kind of Platonic mathematical space. I do not, because I don't have evidence that it
Hmm.
exists. I will say this is totally speculation, and I won't say that I believe in it or have any evidence for it, just that it's an interesting idea. I've heard people say that if you could stand outside the universe, like in some greater, higher dimension than we live in, you could like hold our universe in your hand and you could see all of everything like laid out at once as some kind of like timeless crystal, all kinds of all the like lines of causality and everything just there, and you could see it. From our perspective in this universe, that sounds similar to how we see math. We can kind of hold it all in our hand and see all the lines spreading out. There's no time, but like the lines of causality, so to speak, are all the theorems you can derive, spreading out in every direction based on the assumptions you make. And so there is something interestingly analogous there. So, could mathematics potentially be some kind of lower dimension universe that we are in some way studying and maybe exploiting some property from? I have no idea, and I wouldn't say that that informs how I think in any way. But I do think if you want to talk about Platonic spaces, that's an interesting analogy to maybe explore and consider further. As for how the sorting algorithm thing works, so for listeners who don't know, Mike has a fascinating paper. Like just type in like Michael Levin sorting algorithm into Google, and it should be the first thing that comes up, where he takes these sorting algorithms, which are very simple coded programs that you could code up on your own computer in like half an hour or 10 minutes. I don't do coding, but like it's very simple, and it's like 10 lines of code, and you would think looking at it like the code is the program, and so by seeing what the code says you should fully understand the competencies of the system. But what Mike shows is that if you challenge the system to address problems it wasn't programmed to solve, it is able to find solutions to reach a state that like minimizes its free energy. And so it has competencies that you cannot perceive directly in the code. And so this is just interesting from Mike's perspective, in part because he's trying to show that cells and things have surprising competencies, and you can't just assume that you know what they can do. And I draw on these ideas in my paper about externality, which is on my website, section 2.2 on hidden competencies, as a way of thinking about how to understand externality. But as far as what's going on mathematically, I think the answer is just that the reason there's more going on than the code is because there's literally more going on than the code. There's the whole physical system around the code, and all of these, every molecule and atom still has its own agency. It doesn't, it's the code. There's almost this like golem fallacy. Let me coin the golem fallacy. So in like Jewish mythologies, there's this concept of a golem. It's like this big clay sort of anthropomorphic creature that when you put like sort of magic Hebrew words into its head, it suddenly acquires the ability to like act and speak like a human. That's sort of like a very sort of primitive take on AI. And there is often this assumption people make that somehow the way causation occurs is by doing something analogous to what Jews thought you could do with a golem, which is to somehow put a command into something and have things obey the command. So for a long time, how people thought motor behavior worked, like moving my hands around, is that the brain just sends a command to the muscles, and maybe that command is written in some kind of electrical language, but like quite literally, the brain is just saying, "Hey, hand, do this." Now, it turns out this is not what's happening. There are no commands. I won't go into detail, but that is a false model of human behavior. And I believe it's a false model of behavior in general. It's not how reality works. So when you're coding some system and you think, okay, my codes are my golem words that are just going to fully control how the system works, I've created the commands and the system will obey my commands. That's not really what's going on. There's a wider system with its own agency and sense of optimization. What you've really done is incentivized the system to accomplish your goals. And that it could be useful to model it as commanding it for some purpose, but for other purposes, like what Mike showed, that model breaks down.
Mm. And then so when we see systems that we don't fully, like with any system, you could say we maybe can never know the full instead of its competencies, because yeah, like with code, you know, like we can kind of see what it does, but I mean, like put it in another environment, you don't know what it's gonna do. Um, and like so, like yeah, and then with mathematics itself, I mean, is there a way in which I don't know, we don't know what mathematics itself kind of can or will do, like, because as you
Yeah,
like, do you
math
think what
is.
you're
Does
even
math
doing in
have
that
hidden
talk is expressing
competencies?
it?
Is that what you're? Are you
Yeah,
trying to get at? Does math have hidden competencies?
maybe. Maybe that's what I'm asking. I'm
Well, one of the most
yeah,
interesting things, and one thing that I think actually did get me started on thinking about mathematical agency, is that math absolutely has hidden competencies. So, math is all about theorems. You make assumptions and you prove theorems. What's interesting about this is that theoretically, the theorems are a tautology. They are just a restatement of your assumptions. You're not showing anything new necessarily to prove something. What you're doing is you're taking your assumptions and you're just changing their form. And yet the theorems often surprise us. That's why they're interesting. You start with assumptions that you have clearly stated. Like, I'm sure if you've taken economics, you've been told math allows us to unambiguously state our assumptions, right? That's why we want to use math instead of talking. If we use math, we will definitely know exactly what we've assumed. And yet, what that means is that our theorems shouldn't surprise us because the theorems are the assumptions. So, math definitely has hidden competencies where, just like the sorting algorithms, the assumptions are like the code and we see them and we think we know exactly what they say, but then we work with them and we change them without really changing them. And we're like, whoa, this is new. I didn't know this could happen. So, math is full of hidden competencies, just like the sorting algorithm. And the point of mathematics is to discover those hidden competencies. That's what mathematicians do literally all day. That's their job, is to discover the hidden competencies of mathematics.
I really like that. That I mean, that's cool. That makes me that because like Michael Levin will always talk about the fact it's kind of problematic of everyone will say like, hey, this biological system does this weird thing. Don't worry, it has some mechanism encoded, say, in the DNA, or like there's some mechanism, we just need to find it. But there's some way in which maybe sometimes you actually the level of biology and trying to find some specific biological mechanism we already know isn't the right level of analysis, because like there are hidden competencies in every part of the system. Like it's not because again, like fundamentally, even mathematics itself has hidden competencies. So it's like not obvious why, if you find something surprising in biology, like where like because for example, related to this is like you can always start with, you could start in biology with the assumption of a cell never has any kind of intelligence or something. Like we know that a cell is like an algorithm and it can't do anything, but but there's mechanisms from DNA such that it can still act like this kind of computer, etc., etc. And if you see the whole system as a whole doing something surprising, don't worry, you never need to look at the cells being something with intelligence or competence, because there is some pathway, some mechanical algorithm that you just need to find it. But I don't know. I don't really know where I'm going with this, but it's kind of making me just rethink. Like, go back. We've looked at mathematics in this new way. How do I think about biology again?
That's exactly the idea. So the reason the talk is called agency at the very bottom, and the reason I think Mike's lab was interested in it, is that if you can accept that math is agentic, if you can accept that math has hidden competencies, then suddenly it's very easy to accept that cells have hidden competencies and agency, because people think, there's sort of layers of fundamentalness, like math, then physics, then I guess chemistry, then biology, then I guess maybe econ, whatever. I don't know that that's true, by the way. I don't know that the evidence for that sort of layers of fundamentalness is really there, but that's what people think. And so, if you can convince people math has this element, then they have to accept that that element is in some way preserved all the way up the chain. So, it should get people thinking differently. On that note, actually, on the subject of
Interesting.
thinking
Awesome.
differently, let me ask you a question. Why are you interested in Mike's work and how did you discover it? This is my podcast now.
Yeah, I will. I no, no, good. Yeah, it's something I've been thinking about recently, because I'm an economics student, and I was interested in his work. Just like kind of, I when I first listened to him on Lex Friedman podcast, I was like, what on earth is he talking about? I kind of got parts of it, but I was like, he's saying that like I never even tried to think about why cells are intelligent, or what, or like I didn't ever think about where memories are stored, or like what happens when, oh, you cut off the head of this planaria, but it still knows how to do things. Or there was so much that I didn't understand. So, and then in part, it's like, on the one hand, I could be like, I should just ignore that. That's some biology. That's computer science. I don't do that. But I just kept being curious of like, why is why is this person talking about things that I have no idea, and I've never, no one told me that I should be thinking about these kinds of things. And then it's funny because when I then talked to Michael Levin, some of my friends pointed out that like, hey, you started asking him about things like the competencies in systems like economies or systems greater than biology, and this is something you talk about on like other
Oh
podcasts.
no, you're
And
cutting
so,
out for me.
and
So
I
I
was like,
heard
oh
you say
yeah.
something about
So there
competencies.
was
I
a
don't
way
know
in
if
which
this
it
is
felt like
my
there was a
connection or
convergence of
yours.
like, I okay. Well,
Sorry, so I
sure.
lost
Sometimes you
about, I
cut out
think,
as
maybe
well.
30
Yeah,
seconds or
I was
something.
saying
You're
kind
saying
of,
your friends were surprised, like you had asked Michael Levin about something.
yeah, yeah. And I guess I realized that actually he was influencing my thinking, and it came back and traveled back to some of the things I've been thinking about, sort of in other areas, um, uh, in like the competencies of economics, and kind of thinking about cognition within economics. Like, what kind of problems does it solve? I mean, as well, in even saying something like that, what kind of problems does economics solve? Articulating even that is something which Michael Levin probably has influenced me to say. So yeah, and I guess it's something which is interesting, that like in general, which is something a podcast shows you. It's, you kind of just want people that think really deeply. Whatever they're interested in. You realize that if you talk to a physicist, if they think deeply about whatever field they do, then you can kind of understand how they think, why they're asking the questions they're asking, and that like whatever you think you're interested in, whatever field, so to speak, you're in, it kind of is and is interesting. And I mean, you did you reach out to Michael Levin? Why are you interested in his work?
Yeah, so I mean, I found out about his work just from some random YouTube video, and I saw some connections. I actually originally emailed him maybe a year prior to the mathematical agency talk about an unrelated paper that I'm actually working on with my brother, which is about some intersections of economics and neuroscience because he studies neuroscience. And I just noticed that. We basically talked. It wasn't recorded, but basically, I just said, some of your research seems relevant, so I just want to like understand, am I understanding this correctly? And we chatted about that. So that's how I originally got interested in that. um, yeah, I mean, basically, for quite a while, I've basically thought it seems plausible that like the brain and the body, you could think of it as an economy of cells, which would
Like that.
require the cells to be in some way agentic. And so it just really stood out to me that someone in biology was studying that and making related claims.
Interesting. So it's, in listening to another conversation you had, it reminds you of that, where you talked there about the way in which, how do all the different cells kind of in a biological system all coordinate with each other, and it kind of reminds you of like an economic system of like, how does everyone sort of get round their business and sort of get what they need and provide things for others. It's like kind of, there's a recapitulation in biology of what's going on in economic systems.
Mhm.
Is that along the lines of like thing you're thinking about in this paper you were writing?
Yes, and so this takes us to the direction of the economics of collective intelligence. So this is actually something I've talked to Mike about, and we didn't record that one, but we'll be talking about it again, and we should be recording at that time. So you'll see an elaboration of ideas about biology being a collective intelligence, and I'll basically argue that economics gives us the correct sort of theoretical abstract picture of collective intelligence. So if you're an economist, if you've studied economics, you've been studying collective intelligence, maybe without realizing it. And to that direction, how much time do you have this evening?
Lots of time.
Excellent. So I want to try something. So no
Lots of
pressure, but
time.
I just want to
Yeah.
see how this goes. I think the economics of collective intelligence is in some way very simplistic. And all it really requires is a willingness to think abstractly and just kind of take certain conceptual steps. So let me just ask you: are you familiar with the essay "I Pencil"?
I actually am. It's a great one. So when you talk, explain it.
Yeah, absolutely. So iPencil is super important. Everyone needs to know about it. So what iPencil basically is, if you just type it into Google, I comma pencil, it'll be the first thing that comes up. There's a YouTube video as well, like an animation of it. It just quite literally points out that making a pencil is super complicated. Like the production process behind a pencil, it seems like such a simple object, but actually it spans the entire Earth. Literally, like many countries are involved in producing a pencil, millions of people working together, coordinated across, potentially decades to create a pencil. The actual process of it is insanely complicated. There's no individual person or any kind of centralized computer or anything that has a fraction of the knowledge necessary to build a pencil. And yet, building a pencil is something that is constantly achieved. It's very easily coordinated. And I'll, in fact, show you. So, a little visual demonstration. This is a pencil, takes millions of people to make it over decades, international effort. Who cares? Because they're so common. The production process is so reliable that pencils are a dime a dozen and you do not care about them. So that is the iPencil. And it's basically saying the economy is super complicated. There isn't just like a set of instructions you can give people, just be like, go do this now, and that's all going to work out. You need a process that coordinates everyone, and somehow that process seems to be largely invisible, even though it controls basically everything and is the reason that we have, food to eat and clothes to wear. And that sounds a lot like what's going on in a cell, because, or in a body, because as we know, the cells don't just have instructions from the DNA. They're not dumb inert objects. They have their own agency, and they've got to figure out what to do with each other to somehow keep the body alive. And economics is the abstract science that explains how that is accomplished through the price system, which, as we know, is that coordinating system. And so, with that in mind, what can you tell me about the economics of collective intelligence? What does that mean to you, and what do you think that looks like?
Like, what do you mean? But so as in looking at an economy itself as a kind of collective
Yeah,
intelligence.
yeah, just doing
Like,
economics. So we're not
well,
biologists, so just economics wise. In what sense is an economy a
right.
collective intelligence? What would that mean, and how would you theorize about that?
Let's see. I mean, when it's when I'm thinking about intelligence. Let's see. I mean, I think about like an individual agent is kind of like they're trying to get things for themselves, so they're using their own intelligence to kind of do things, and then okay, but you keep zooming out, so individuals are doing things, but and then you know making a pencil is interesting, right? Because I mean the collective process of how you make it, like in again in the iPencil essay of there's loads of different factories and there's countries produce one little thing and another country some other little thing in the pencil, um, and then so it's completely different to how you'd even make a pencil if like someone told you, hey, go make a pencil, and you can't you can't just buy one. It's so on the large scale you're doing something completely different to what like you could even do if you were like a very small group of people. But that sounds like I'm reiterating basic economics. Like, yeah, that's what economics does is like you now as a collective do more than what you do as an individual. Um, and like something that I thought about when I was like reading and thinking about a lot of your work is kind of and as well I've even written about these kinds of things is like where is the where is the intelligence even like where are the you have prices you can there's some things you can spot like money prices people doing things factories but are these the most important things where actually is all the information stored of how to make this pencil, like what are the flows of people and transactions and what makes that keep going and what what things could you would stop that, and therefore, because then and stop these so-called intelligence of the system. Um, I don't know. That was my best attempt.
No, I appreciate that, and those are all reasonable questions. So, Mike has talked about memories not really being stored anywhere,
I hear that.
and I think the same is true with intelligence. I'll also say so. The Nobel Prize-winning economist Friedrich Hayek, he wrote a book called The Sensory Order in 1952 that also talks about these concepts, and he'll also talk about how things aren't really stored anywhere. Instead, there are systems that basically have a congruent system of relationships with what you're trying to deal with, but nothing's just stored anywhere in a physical sense. So intelligence is what we call like an emergent property, which means we don't really know how it works. There's something mysterious that's confusing us. It is in some way a hidden competency. I don't know why it is that when you add humans to each other in the way that the price system does and scale up their intelligence, why does it scale at all? Why does it scale in the way that we see it doing? Why does it allow us to build a pencil? I don't know the answers to those questions. But I'll give you my intuition about this. And this goes back to Adam Smith. Have you read The Theory of Moral Sentiments?
I read a bit. Maybe talk about it.
Yeah, so a bit's great because it's a fantastic book, but also like super hard to read because it was written, a million years ago. But I think it's a very important book because it's actually a very empirical book. What Adam Smith is doing is he's very carefully looking at human behavior. So it's not empirical in a modern sense because he's not like collecting all these data and running regressions on it, but it is empirical in the sense that he is focused on looking at things. And that's the basics of science. Before you can get all the data and do all the regressions, you have to just like take an object and just like look at it and just see stuff about it. And that's what he's doing with people. And there's this very interesting hypothetical scenario he discusses, which is updated slightly for modern times. Let's say that you're watching TV and a news story comes on about an earthquake in China. 1 million Chinese people have died. And just as you're hearing about this horrific tragedy, you stub your toe against like the leg of a table. In that moment, what matters more to you? 1 million dead people far away or the pain in your toe? You can say it. Come on. It's the
The
pain in
pain
your
in the
toe.
toe, probably.
Absolutely, right? You're going to be
Oh, it
hopping,
hurts so much.
cursing, like, this really hurts, like, this sucks. It's going to control your behavior. What's going on with that? The modern view of that, I think, should be is that it's all about internal models. You are connected to yourself via a shared model that runs throughout you. So this is bioelectricity, right? Your cells communicate with each other in electrical ways. And what by passing signals back and forth, they reach an equilibrium where they all agree on what the model is saying, because if they didn't, they would change something about the signals they're passing and therefore the model itself. And it is that shared model that unites your cells into a collective intelligence and turns a big pile of chemical goop into Jack or into Benjamin or into anyone else. And what's going on with your toe dominating the 1 million dead people far away from you is that you are not in a shared model with them. When things happen to them, you don't know about it. So, Mike talks about this like when you train a rat to like do something and then you reward it with food. The part of the rat, like maybe you train to put its paw on something. Well, the paw cells and the tongue cells that like get the food, they don't have anything to do with each other. So why are they working together? And the answer, presumably, is a shared model. Similarly, when we look at the 1 million dead people, there's just no shared model there. You're not connected to them in a signaling relationship. So when things happen to them, you don't really know about it. Like you can see a news story, but it is physically incapable of influencing you the same way that something that happens to one of your cells is. So when we look at economics, the question is, when you're thinking about a body, it's easy to think that it's all about physical connection because we perceive a continuous physical connection, which isn't necessarily really true because physics is weird and there's like actually secret holes and everything because everything's super tiny, but it feels like there's a continuous physical connection. But when you think about an economy, you're not physically connected to some worker on the other side of the world who's helping you build a pencil. So the question then is, what signaling system could possibly unite the world into a single shared model and allow us to scale up our competencies and solve problems as a collective intelligence? So what is that system?
Hmm. I don't know. Like we the I guess it's why we call something like the economy. It's why we haven't. There's it's I guess I always say there's no system that does that like perfectly, but we kind of have we through the fact that we have prices, we have money, and we don't completely clamp down on them. We allow these kinds of things to exist, and at least saying those things, there's at least some channels through which we're connected to everyone. But even then, when I say something like prices or money, that's almost that's one step. That's kind of an intermediary for how we're all connected. Um, I mean, but yeah, through prices and things, it channels our values, right? We start making decisions using that money, using that medium, and so it's actually something a bit more kind of like like a kind of implicit information within prices, within money. What do you think about this?
I think you're exactly
Is
right. The
what is the
price
economy
system,
in reference to this?
yeah, you're exactly right. The price system is the correct answer. The price system is economics' version of bioelectricity. It is the price system that unites us all, scales up our abilities, allows us to know what's going on with each other without having to achieve some kind of physical continuity. And this is exactly what we learn about in Econ 101 when we learn about supply and demand. So if you have some increased need, like let's say your shoes wear out and you need shoes. So like Mike would call this a stress, right? You're experiencing a novel stress and you need shoes. You could like run out into the town square and say, "Help, help, I need shoes." But like people are self-interested and no one's going to care. What you do instead is you bid on a new pair of shoes. In doing so, you constitute increased demand and you very slightly raise the price. And so if I'm a shoe seller, I don't know about your life and I don't care about you, but I see that price, and because of my supply curve, right, my quantity supplied is going to increase, right? Like I'm going to say, okay, I'm going to sell another shoe because I can make a bit more money doing that. And so I'm going to take care of your stress, not because I love you, I care about you, I'm self interested, but just because you've passed a signal in a way to me such that your problem is now my problem. And by solving your problem, I solve my own problems. Taking care of you is like taking care of me. And in a way, this is the key to collective intelligence. You need a system that takes questions about other people and turns them into questions about yourself.
Interesting. Yeah, that's really great. And like off the air, I kind of even asked about things like what is the nature of and boundary of the self, and it's a difficult one, but it makes me think. Could one think about a biological system like a multicellular organism as like us, each of the cells within it selfish? Are they or they're or even if they're not, it's a weird that's a word and it's a tricky to define it, but it's as you kind of say they need they're the model of themselves, right? And so but they're in a way reliant on all the other cells around them. So how can they translate the needs and all the signals that they're getting from around them, from neighboring cells, etc., into something like I know that I got signals about something else, but this is about me somehow. Actually, they because in some sense you can only you you only have one model. Maybe there's some model and you need to translate that to how it's about you. Otherwise, it's really nothing. It's kind of non-existent. It's kind of like the way we kind of treat like millions of people dying somewhere else, and it's not as relevant to us as something sort of very immediate.
Mhm.
Interesting.
Yes. So, first of all, so the way I understand self interest is that it is in no way related to the concept of selfishness, which I just don't believe is a very scientifically useful idea. Like, it's fine for navigating your personal life. Like, if you're like, I don't like this guy, he's selfish, that's fine. But in terms of economic science, we should be thinking just about self interest. And I understand self interest is a very literal and physical claim about the things that you pay attention to. When something pokes you in the head, you feel that and you notice that. You are interested in yourself. Like, take interest very literally. Like, you're going to pay attention to that. If someone pokes you in the head and I'm not looking directly at you, I won't even realize that that's happening. No matter how much I try to, and it's an informational signaling problem. Like, if I try really hard to care about you, but I don't know what's happening to you, like, I can't see your feet. it's entirely possible that your feet are literally like being sawed off by a crazy person right now. And because I don't know that, there's nothing I could do to possibly try to address that situation. Even if you're like my favorite person in the world and I want so hard to take care of you, if I am not receiving information about that, I can't address it. The way the price system works, and the way I suspect bioelectricity works as well, is we're all optimizing with respect to a set of signals we can all see. We can all see, food prices, gas prices, etc. And so we can all be like pretty confident. Well, we don't even have to be aware of this, but like we are all optimizing with respect to the same model. And as prices reach equilibrium, especially if you imagine if like the law of one price holds, which it doesn't in real life, but the law of one price means the price of everything should be the price of a good should be the same everywhere. The argument being that if like an apple is more expensive in like one country than another, you should buy apples from where it's cheaper, sell where it's higher until the price equilibrates. Like if that were true, we would all be optimizing with respect to identical signals. So at that point, we all share a single shared internal model, and we're all at that point kind of the same person. And in fact, what I called it before I knew the term collective intelligence, I've been very liberal with borrowing Mike's language, but before that, I just called it everyone becomes the same person, which is less catchy. But I do like something about how literal that is because I think that that's kind of true. If who you are is your internal model, and we all have the same shared model we're working from, we have kind of become the same person.
Your video is just kind of lagging. Okay, it's interesting. Yeah, that I mean, because what else would it? It's yeah. Again, we're trying to define almost what is the self, but yeah, if your needs are you're getting the same, you have the same model, or you're getting the same information as other parts of a system, um, you're in a way at least coordinated in such in a sense that whatever you do will act to kind of and just I'm just like I'm very interested in I'm just sort of playing with the idea of the insight of prices being a kind of way in which this analogy to even bioelectricity, of like you look at everything around you, even just and you're kind of thinking like how valuable is this, and like to what degree do I need this versus others, right? And but I would say I guess prices do this in part, but there's no perfect market, there's no perfect way to sell things, and it's not the only way to think about things in your environment as well as a way in which you can sell them to someone. Um, but yeah, it makes me think that like if there was some perfect call it economic system or some kind of price system or some way in which the word there's some analogous thing to prices. There's some other way kind of where we could transfer information because I had a conversation recently with someone about um you know we use money at the moment like it's like a thing we use a lot we to buy and sell things, right? But maybe money is a very low sort of information holding thing. It's like money is a bit crude, right? It takes its transaction costs. There's other things we need to do. What about like me and you in this conversation right now? We're transferring information, we're learning things. Why are we speaking with each other? What are we getting out of this conversation? There are other ways of, you can say, transacting with people. There are other things that we get of value, um, beyond just money. And so so when we think about even things like language and concepts itself, like maybe one could even do away with money at a certain point, or like I'm just kind of just playing with the idea of what do we even mean by money in the sense of it's that we need something to transfer this information around to almost have the same model of the like a shared reality. But you know money even at the moment is changing, right? I mean, there's physical money, but then like increasingly it's digital, so
Mhm.
yeah.
Yes, well, I primarily think of money as a unit of account, and so I don't really see how you could get rid
Hmm.
of that in a practical sense because you need a unit of account so you can do accounting. Um, as far as like looking for an alternative to the price system, I think we have a lot of reason mathematically to believe that any system that can do the job of the price system will be mathematically analogous to the price system. So maybe you could disguise it and obscure it to human eyes, but underneath it will still effectively be the price system. That's never going to change. There's a lot of what's that paper called? Like the competitive allocation system is informationally efficient uniquely or something like that. But yeah, there's a bunch of results about that. Like the price system is not going to, it's only going to become more of what it is. Like perfecting the price system means taking the current system and making it more like what it's ultimately going to be. We're not going to replace that in a mathematically meaningful sense. I'll also say, in terms of people looking for alternative kinds of systems and ways of doing things, I know that I talk about ideas that sound strange and like I'm going into odd places. What I believe about economics is that mainstream economics is basically right about basically everything. For virtually any economic question you could possibly ask, mainstream economics will give you a decent answer. It's like sort of, physicists might not like this comparison, but it's like a weak version of the standard model. So the standard model in physics does an amazing job of explaining almost everything. There's a few gaps and holes, but basically almost every physical question, the standard model nails it to like a million decimal points. Economics doesn't have that same level of precision, but we have something similar to the standard model in the sense that, with maybe a few small exceptions, pretty much everything can be explained by that model. When I am going into weird places, all that I see myself as doing is taking mainstream economics and applying it in ways that to me seems entirely logical. And where I differ from mainstream economists is that I believe in mainstream economics more than they do. They're more willing to say, well, maybe economics just can't apply to that, or you need a different model for that. And I'm like, no, it works. We can just keep using the same model forever because it is already basically perfect. That's how I see economics. And I am not looking for alternatives to things conceptually or practically, because I think what we have already works very well. And a lot of people do want like alternatives to economics and different ways of thinking. I think mostly what they should do is familiarize themselves with the current way of economic thinking, because if they do so, they will see that it in fact answers most of their questions.
Like, and that makes me want to, because you said you went to George Mason University, is that right?
Mm-hmm.
And so tell me about then, because I've done economics for a while, but like I'm still interested in like the Austrian school of economics. Like, what do we mean by classical economics then? Because now I'm like very interested in, yeah, what are its then fundamental laws such that, as you say, actually don't mess around with it. It's actually like this very kind of simple, clear, even mathematical in a way, and it can be applied to loads of different systems. So tell me a bit about that, and what we also get wrong if we try and think like, people trying to go, actually, maybe we should be more empirical and look at the world, and like maybe we can develop a new kind. Like, why is that wrong?
Sure. So, yeah, George Mason University was great, a fantastic economics department. I actually originally didn't want to go there after I got accepted. I just wanted to stay somewhere more local. But I was already very interested in economics at that time. And my dad was like, "You idiot. George Mason is obviously the place. You need to go to a place with economists who are that engaged, who are that creative. Get out of my house. Go to George Mason University." So I went to George Mason University, and it was absolutely the right thing to do. The professors there are fantastic. They're one of a kind. And they did a tremendous amount. They were just very generous with their time and very encouraging of me as an undergraduate student. I had nothing to contribute. Most of my ideas were very stupid, and they were very nice to me and very helpful. As for the ideas there, so I actually engaged very little with Austrian economics. Hayek is very important to my thought. The use of knowledge in society may be the most important paper ever written, but Hayek's also like that. That's mainstream. Like that part of him has been absorbed into the mainstream. I think Mises was a very important economist historically. What he did to initiate the socialist calculation debate was crucial both for economics as a discipline and also may have saved millions of lives. But as an actual, for me personally, I can't actually say there's a lot of influence there, except maybe indirect influence through Hayek. And then the rest of Austrian economics, I don't know much about. I feel like I read a little bit of Menger, a little bit of Baum-Bauer, but I just don't remember that much. For the most part, I'm just doing normal textbook economics that any economist will do. But there are certainly some Austrian influences at George Mason University. One of the professors I talked to a lot, Peter Leeson, he's certainly very big on Mises. He's a great guy. So I have a lot of sympathy for people who are interested in that stuff. I can't say it meant a lot to me personally, like the specifically Austrian side of it. And ultimately, I do feel that mainstream economics is just right about basically everything, and people should just use it for basically everything.
Great. It's this has been super insightful. Is there any final comments you want to make, or anything you want to say as we close this off?
Yeah, check out my website. So look at my paper about the problem of externality, because that's where this all comes from. It's just benjaminflyons.com. That's F as in Frederick, Lyons, like the animal, but with a Y as in yellow. And if this interests you, email me. Also, I'm unemployed and I need money. I need a job. So if you are hiring, or if you know anyone who is hiring, please email me. I need money. Thank you very much. This has been great. Thank you, Jack. I really appreciate being on here.
Yeah, awesome. Thank you.